I always like to start with a introduction to the Indian Child Welfare Act, and with that I like to start with a little bit of the history behind the law, why we have the law. I will warn everyone, since this is a live version of the online training that's being created, there may be more slides than we can cover today. So I'll do my best to cover everything that I think you need to know, but I did make a little bit more written material than we may have time to cover in the presentation, and that's because online we obviously have a little more freedom to include more written material. So with that, early Indian child welfare policies, we're going to start with pre-Indian Child Welfare Act. Why did we lead up to the Indian Child Welfare Act? And even though it really dates back further than the boarding school era, for our purposes we're going to talk about the boarding school era. And you can see here we have the motto of the boarding schools in quotations: kill the Indian, save the man. And that was actually carved into doorways and made an official policy of the boarding schools during the boarding school era, so that the children would actually visually see that, kill the Indian, save the man. So in 1870, Congress authorized an annual appropriation of $100,000, which is a lot of money today. Back in 1870, you can only imagine how much of an appropriation that is. And that was for the support of industrial and other schools among tribes not otherwise provided for. And these schools were run by missionaries. And that is of interest because of the policy that the U.S. government at this point was very recently adopting around separation of church and state. That was the official federal policy. However, when it came to policies involving Native Americans, Indian children, it seemed that the policy was being ignored, and missionaries were actually being funded to run schools to assimilate Indian children. The schools were just that. They were mechanisms to assimilate Indian children. They didn't focus on reading and writing in the same way that schools would today for children. They focused more on assimilation, teaching children English instead of their native language, prohibiting the speaking of their native languages. Also, some trades were taught, but the emphasis really wasn't on academics. And children were often punished for practicing any of their traditional culture, whether it was language or any kind of other practices. While these schools were successful in really damaging the tribal way of life and the way tribes function even today, they were not successful enough to assimilate all Indian children and really destroy tribes the way they were intended. Tribal people and tribes continue to cling to their tribal way of life, and you see that in just the pure fact that tribes exist today. Traditions, languages, it's all still there, preserved by those people who, for whatever reason, found the strength to continue to practice their culture and tradition. Following the Indian boarding schools was the Indian Adoption Project. And the Indian Adoption Project started in 1958. So yes, we skipped forward 100 or so years. Obviously, there's more history in there, but we do want to get to courtroom preparation. So in 1958, the Federal Indian Adoption Project was funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They funded care for 2,300 children through the removal, foster placement, and eventual adoption of Indian children. And states followed this federal example, and soon following the beginning of the Federal Indian Adoption Project, through state social workers, private adoption agencies, police, there was a wholesale removal of Indian children happening across the nation. And the children were not being placed with Indian families. They were being placed off the reservation outside of their communities with non-Indian families. Congress has collected statistics from this era, and nationally, during the Indian Adoption Project era, Indian children were 3 times more likely than non-Indian to be placed for foster care or adoption. And about 25 to 35% of all Indian children had been removed from their homes and placed in foster homes, adoptive homes, or institutions. I just want to stress the significance of this number. 25 to 35% of Indian children had been removed. That's all Indian children who had just basically gone missing from their communities, leaving a big gap in the community, which is, still there for many communities and for many individuals. In California, since this is a California-specific training, and I am a member of a California tribe, the Yurok tribe, I am, biased toward California data. It's what I like to focus on. So in California, we look at the statistics, and it shows that 8 times as many Indian children as non-Indian children were in adoptive homes, and that 90% of these Indian children were in non-Indian homes. Indian children who'd been placed in non-Indian adoptive homes frequently suffered serious adjustment and acceptance problems. And that probably sounds really obvious to everyone in the audience today. And that's something that they're focusing more on when students are studying to get their master's degree in social work today. But back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was this statistic, this finding was unexpected. The goal of the Indian Adoption Project was to place Indian children outside of their homes because it was believed they would be better off. And here we have the finding that Indian children who had been placed in non-Indian adoptive homes were actually suffering adjustment and acceptance problems. And so, however well-intentioned this policy of removing Indian children was, the outcomes were devastating to Indian communities and to Indian children. And the conclusion by Congress was that legal means were necessary to stop these practices and ensure that we reverse the way we approached Native American communities and their children going forward. So, with that history, where are we now? So now we're going to look at the Indian Child Welfare Act and California juvenile dependency cases in a contemporary way. So first, let's talk about Indians in California today. There are over 100 federally recognized tribes just within the state of California, and that's more than any other state except for Alaska. Many of the tribes in California are unrecognized. Federal recognition or federal acknowledgement is a political status that tribes share with the federal government. In 2008, there were 74 petitions filed with the Bureau of Indian Affairs for federal recognition. And that's just an example of a snapshot of how many tribes are still searching for that recognition from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. California is also home to the largest number of Indian people, and the majority of the Indian population within California are from out-of-state tribes. And this slide, basically all the statistics here on this slide, makes the California Indian population pretty unique. We've got more people who are Indian in the state from tribes outside of California than we do from local tribes. We've also got the largest number of tribes other than Alaska, and we've got several tribes still seeking recognition. So we've got quite a diverse population here in California, which makes, I think, compliance with the Indian Child Welfare Act challenging sometimes for social workers in child welfare cases. So we have the Indian Child Welfare Act. I do a lot of trainings for state or county, if you will, county social workers. And sometimes I get asked the question, why do we need the Indian Child Welfare Act today? That was a long time ago that social workers were removing children from the reservations. That's not happening anymore, so why do we need it? Well, the answer is, and I do look at statistics and rely on some of the statistical data that the California Child Welfare System collects. And if you look at that data, you see that Native American children are the second most overrepresented population in California's child welfare system. The first most overrepresented population is African American children. And what overrepresentation means is that there are a disproportionate number of Native American children in the child welfare system compared to how many Native American children there are in the population of California's children generally. So that's what overrepresented means, and it's not a positive thing. It's not positive at all to be overrepresented in the child welfare system. And then if you look at the placement statistics that are recorded, you see that the majority of the out-of-home placements for Indian children are not in compliance with the Indian Child Welfare Act. And that's based on data that comes from the California child welfare system that all the counties in California use to input their placement statistics and removal statistics and everything that they gather about the case that has to do with ICWA compliance. Okay, so moving forward, what are the minimum standards for the Indian Child Welfare Act? Excuse me. So starting with sort of the purpose of the Indian Child Welfare Act, and we did talk about this a little bit in talking about the history and why Congress, after convening their different task force and finding that the Indian Child Welfare Act was necessary. But this really sort of puts a fine point on it. The purpose of the Indian Child Welfare Act is to shift the legal presumption from Indian children are better off growing up outside their community to it's essential for the survival of tribes and tribal people that Indian children grow up in the Indian community. And just for me personally, I really do believe that. I think that it is essential for tribes and for Native American children to grow up in their communities. And that, as I stated earlier, was not the feeling just even as recent as the 1970s. People really did think that Indian children were better off growing up outside of their communities. So as everybody probably knows in the audience, changing minds is much more difficult than changing the law, but a lot of times you start with the law and then the sentiment will change around it. So in order to change the bias that was going on and the bias practices, Congress shifted the legal presumption by passing the Indian Child Welfare Act. So regardless of what any individual worker might think or any individual county might think, we now have laws that protect Indian children and also that protect tribes. And that's really the focus of today is, as a tribal representative, what is your role and how can you ensure that that role is protected? Ooh, I'm getting emails. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, so what is the Indian Child Welfare Act? And this may be review for some of you, but we really wanted to create this introduction to ICWA to be accessible to any level of knowledge about the Indian Child Welfare Act. So the Indian Child Welfare Act is a federal law that was passed in 1978, so really not that long ago. It establishes minimum federal standards that must be applied in state custody proceedings involving Indian children. And it acknowledges and implements the tribe's right to intervene in state child custody proceedings. And that was something that was not standard prior to passing the Indian Child Welfare Act. Many children were being removed, placed out of their homes, placed off the reservation without even notice to their tribe. And so now tribes not only are entitled to notice, but they're entitled to intervene as a party in state child custody proceedings. This is a huge legal shift from what was actually happening prior to the act passing in 1978. And then finally, it's really important to note that the Indian Child Welfare Act is a political distinction rather than a racial distinction. And what that means is that the act is applied to children based on their political status with their tribe, not on their racial identity, being Indian or Native American. And that is actually something that has been confirmed by the United States Supreme Court. They did hear a case on the Indian Child Welfare Act. The act was challenged based on the constitutionality, claiming that it applied racial preferences. And the United States Supreme Court found, no, it's not a racial preference, it's a political distinction. And so that's something to note. And it comes up when you look at what is the definition of an Indian child. An Indian child really is defined by their status with their tribe, if their tribe considers them to be a member or not. Then we move into California's ICWA. So the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act, and that's ICWA, that's the abbreviation for the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA. So federal ICWA provides for optional additional state protections, which means if a state chooses, they can actually pass laws that are more protective of tribes, more protective of Indian children. No one can go below the minimum federal standards, but you can go above and beyond based on what your state policy or law is around the federal, around the child welfare involving Indian children. And California has actually passed specific California codes that respond to the ICWA, the federal ICWA. And California is not the only state that's done this. There are several other states across the nation that have passed more protective laws, or even just laws that echo the federal protections, so that it's really clear to those who are practicing in the state what is required in a case involving an Indian child. So in 2006, Senate Bill 678 passed in response to the continuing lack of compliance with the Indian Child Welfare Act that was passed nearly 30 years before the Senate bill was passed in 2006. And so you'll see, here's some of my bias playing in again. When I talk about the act passing in 1978, I'll say that that wasn't that long ago. But when I talk about compliance, I'll say it's been over actually 30 years, and we should be getting it right. So I definitely play both sides of that coin there. But the point is that California was seeing an unprecedented number of ICWA appeals coming through the court system, and the appeals that were being reversed, or the cases that were being reversed, so people who were winning their ICWA appeals and having the case reversed in the lower courts, was actually totaling more than all other cases being reversed on appeal combined in the California court system. And that really sparked the legislature to respond by passing this enhanced laws that took, they implemented both the Indian Child Welfare Act itself and then some additional protective features that are specific to California into our California codes. So now you can find provisions of the Indian Child Welfare Act in the Welfare and Institutions Code, which is abbreviated WIC here, the Family Code, and also the Probate Code. And for those of us and you who practice in the Indian Child Welfare Act field in California, this was a great benefit, because no longer do you need to go to the federal law to rely on a separate document. You can look right to the California codes. Of course, the federal law still applies in California, and you can and should rely on it as documentation of your arguments, but for ease of use, for those child welfare workers who are really used to all of their direction coming from the Welfare and Institutions Code, the Indian Child Welfare Act is actually there in the code now. And we'll go through a lot of the specific sections of the Indian Child Welfare Act as we continue with this introduction to the Indian Child Welfare Act. And then finally, the Judicial Council, which is the governing body of all of the courts of California. The California Judicial Council passed rules and forms in response to this legislation. And what's unique about these forms is that they are not juvenile forms, they're not family forms, they're not probate forms. They're ICWA forms that can be filed in any different division of the California courts. And that, again, makes practicing much easier if you are going to be appearing in all of these different courts, which as an ICWA rep, you may find that you need to appear in family court, juvenile court, and probate court. So, what are the minimum federal and California state standards? First, and these are sort of in order of how they will apply in a case. So first you'll have inquiry, and that is California specific. Notice, which is from the federal and California standards. Jurisdiction, which is both in California and federal standards. Active efforts, you'll find that in both California and federal standards. Evidentiary requirements, including qualified expert witnesses, and that is in both California and federal standards. Placement preferences, again, California and federal standards. And these are the Judicial Council forms. And this is just a list of the forms that you'll often encounter in California juvenile cases, starting with the petition, which is it's JV, which is abbreviated for juvenile. And that's a Judicial Council form, JV 100. That's the petition that sort of starts the entire case. You've got the ICWA 005, and that's an info sheet, which is about the inquiry attachment and also notice. You've got the actual inquiry attachment itself, which is ICWA 010A. Some people call it the 10A. You've also got notice, which is the ICWA 030. The Parental Indian Status Form, ICWA 020. The Tribal Intervention Form, which is optional and is not mandatory, that's ICWA 040. And we'll be talking about that form specifically a little bit later in the afternoon. And then transferring a case to tribal court, there are two forms, the ICWA 050 and the ICWA 060. And I believe that you have a list of all of these forms. I'm looking at your booklet. It's my understanding everyone in the room has a handout with several documents in it, including this PowerPoint. And let's see. At page 59 are the California ICWA forms. And I believe that is a shows links to each form, possibly even listing each form there.